Jesus was a Jew. So if you go to Nabi Isa in 3080 or 2580 and you ask him, are you Jewish? A lot of my Jewish friends and Christians will be like, oh, come on, Mujir, this is like the same old, we've heard this so many times on Saturday or Sunday study. For Muslims, though, this is actually not that well known, this history of how we got to where we are.
All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the Sins of Time podcast. I am your host, Tarek Ibrahim, and I'm with Mujir Muneeruddin. And we got this one comment that we're going to isolate from every other comment. So there's a bunch of comments that we're doing, and we're doing this mean comments bit that everyone's seeing, and I'm sure you guys are loving it. But this one actually deserves our full attention, Mujir. And I wanted you to kind of like work with me on this one. You know, last time we said, hey, Tarek, just don't drop all the comments on me. Feel free to carry with me. So we're going to carry this one together.
Okay. I'm serious.
Yeah. The idea here is a lot of people are saying that Jesus was a Jew.
Okay.
Okay. And, you know, from a Muslim perspective, and I would even argue from a Jewish perspective, that maybe they don't agree with that per se. That there's a lot of people that may disagree with that. Muslims, for sure, I think, have a tricky time reconciling. But I think that even when I watch some, let's call them TV shows, that many times that a lot of these Jews, people, and rabbis do not want to claim Jesus as their own. They say he was a rebel, blah, 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 blah. So I don't think they want to even claim him as a Jew. So I'm wondering, in your opinion, where do you think this comment's coming from? What do you think this is all about? And what's your answer to this? And feel free to answer and not answer whatever you want. I'm giving you the real one.
How much time do you have? This is a very long-winded discussion that requires, I would say, going into history about Nabi Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, but not even just his history, but a big chunk of the Israelite history and tradition. Okay? And it also comes down to who you're asking. You're right. There's going to be some Jewish people that say, yeah, especially in the modern era, a lot of people say Jesus was a Jew. I don't know that medieval Christians, when the Roman Catholic Church, for example, under Constantine the Great and beyond, were looking to separate between classic Jewish liturgical practices and sites and new Christian theology and liturgy, that they would have made that link that now modern evangelicals are. And of course, the Muslims have our own perspective, right? I don't know that they're mutually exclusive, at least not the Muslim one. The Muslim one believes that, look, whatever you want to call them, they are part of our theological continuity of tradition that we call Muslims, even if other people want to claim them. But let's take a step back in terms of actually what it means to be Jewish. And there's certainly no consensus on this, right? I'm not sitting here as Rabbi Mujir, and I'm going to tell you guys exactly how it's going to be. I'm not by any stretch even an amateur expert when it comes to anything related to Judaism. I'm just a fan and nerd of theology and history, and so I'll share from an Islamic perspective what a lot of sources say, and I recognize that a lot of people might have their own perspectives on it, and we're all about you putting those into the comments, and we'll talk about them. But really, the conversation starts. Let's go back to the 10th century in history, 10th century BC. So Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salatu wasalam, King Solomon in the Bible, in Islam, he's actually one of the most revered prophets of God. Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salatu wasalam is ruling over what is now considered the kingdom of Israel. Okay. In Islam, it's Muluk Bani Israel, Mamlaka Bani Israel. So Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salatu wasalam, when he dies, there's almost immediately a fracturization in the community. So his son, according to the Bible, because we're going to try and bring in different sources here, according to the Bible, his son, Rehoboam, is actually ruling from the south. So if you look at historic Palestine or the kingdom of Israel, how it was, Jerusalem and what is now the West Bank is actually, I don't know, I can't say West Bank, but Jerusalem and Hebron, these are more to the south. Some of the more holy sites are more to the south. Whereas if you go more to the north into the area that is now neighboring on Syria and Lebanon and these places, it's actually more green, more agricultural. It was historically more prosperous, whereas the southern part around Jerusalem and Hebron was actually a little more barren. It was more desert, just based on the topography and the climate of those places. So there's actually this classic imbalance when Nabi Dawood alayhi salam and Nabi Sulaiman are ruling from the south. They have what you can say is the spiritual legitimacy to rule. And as Muslims, we believe that Nabi Sulaiman and Nabi Dawood had supernatural powers. Nabi Dawood could wield, he was a blacksmith. He had superpowers. He could sing with the trees and the animals. He received the Zabur, or the Psalms of David, alayhi salatu wasalam. Nabi Sulaiman had otherworldly powers. He could speak to all kinds of different species, and he could control different species, including jinns. So to a person who is a contemporary of these holy men, it's fairly obvious that these people are not just your average Joe, Muhammad, or Jonathan. This is like, these are special dudes. So they have this inherent legitimacy to rule, kind of like what we talked about with Jesus, where when the Israelites see this baby in the cradle and his mother's pointing to him, that almost comes with immediate gravitas, where anybody who's there knows that this is not some average child. And so you ought to believe what he and the mother that's bearing him is saying. Once Nabi Sulaiman dies, however, his son Rehoboam is not a prophet. And according to the Bible, which doesn't have necessarily, from my reading, the best, most flattering words to say about Rehoboam, he is generally very oppressive in taxation. So he overplays his hand and he tries to get the northern part of the kingdom or the hemisphere to pay more taxes. So he's kind of oppressive in some way. And this is, I know we're going into a deep dive, but this is important. I know a lot of my Jewish friends and Christians will be like, oh, come on, Mujir, this is like the same old. We've heard this so many times on Saturday or Sunday study. For Muslims, though, this is actually not that well known. This history of how we got to where we are. When Rehoboam starts oppressing, the people in the north are actually more prosperous and influenced. He almost doesn't have that clout to wield them in. So there's almost immediately a civil war, and the northern kingdom ultimately breaks apart. So the southern kingdom, which is where Quds and the Haram Sharif, Al-Aqsa, Mount Moriah in English, the Temple Mount, is to the south, which is still at this point the center of Israelite worship. That goes to the south. Jerusalem is the capital. And to the north, where most of the tribes are, because it's prosperous, they're more populous, there's more money there. Let's say 9 or 10 out of the tribes are actually living to the north. And remember, when I say the tribes are generally emanating from not even generally, the tribes are the descendants of the 12 sons of Nabi Yaqub alayhi salatu wasalam. So, I mean, on a good day where I've had my coffee, I can hammer off all 12, but the two most prominent ones are, over time, the Yehuda tribe, the Yehudim, Judah, and then you've got the Levites, Lawi. So those are two sons, Levi and Judah, of Nabi Yaqub alayhi salam. Generally, over time, the families come to be known respectively for, in the case of Judah, kingship, leadership, and just general leadership and executive leadership within the community, within the diaspora of Bani Israel. And the Levites come to be known for being more priestly, more knowledgeable, and religious leaders. So a lot of the prophets, especially the scholarly prophets, come from the Levitical line. So to give you an example, from Bani Yehuda, you've got Nabi Dawood alayhi salam, you've got Nabi Sulaiman, the kings, the most powerful and majestic. From Bani Lawi, Levi, the Levitical line, you have Nabi Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, the bringer of the Torah. He's the ultimate father of the priests in so many ways. Nabi Harun alayhi salam, whose descendants come to be known as the Kohanim, who are the imams of the Haram Sharif. They are the Kohanim, the ones that are most closely associated with the Temple Mount daily practice, and they are the ones that are the priestly class that are interpreting the Torah and all the scriptures, and so they're almost like the imams. But it's hereditary. In some ways, it's kind of like Shias have this concept of imamat, and it's hereditary. That's kind of what the Kohanim become over time. So by the time you get to the 9th century BC or the 800s, when Rehoboam was ruling, and you've got this fracture, you literally have the 10 tribes that are to the north that are being overtaxed, and they're more populous. They fracturize and they become their own country, which historically is considered the kingdom of Israel to the north, and the kingdom of Judea stays to the south. And Jerusalem is the capital here, and in the north it's Shechem, which is Nablus, is the capital to the north. So that fracturization happens. Now, immediately from a geographical standpoint, Al-Quds, Jerusalem, is where Nabi Dawood's family, the house of David, is housed. And also very close to that is the house of Benjamin, who is the brother of Nabi Yusuf alayhi salam. So Nabi Yusuf's family are called the Manasseh and the Ephraim tribe, and they're generally to the north. So what happens over time is the Assyrians in 721 come and they sack the kingdom of Israel, and they massacre or disperse most of the 10 tribes to the north. So those are called the 10 lost tribes of Israel to the north. So a lot of times we actually don't know what happened to Nabi Yusuf's family. There's no remnants of that family. Even Benjamin, his family sort of lost. All the other ones like Issachar, Reuben, Shimeon, Zebulun, Gad, Asher, all their families are generally lost. So the Levites initially moved to the north, per what I've read in reports. But what ends up happening is Jeroboam, the general to the north, and we talked about this privately, Jeroboam realizes that the center of Israelite worship and ideology and identification is the Haram Sharif. So he goes, how can I disconnect the people from the south so they stay here in the north? So they start creating false temples of worship for different gods, and they actually bring back Ishtar and all these other false deities, and they create all these houses of worship. So the Levites and the Kohanim, they're like, absolutely not. Under our dead body, are we going to go along with this? And if you're a cynic, you're going to say, well, their raison d'être, their whole reason of existing, doesn't jive with what's happening in the north. So they go, hey, let's just go back to Jerusalem. At least we have some primacy over there. So regardless of how you look at it, they end up back in Jerusalem. So over time, what ends up happening is the only people left in the southern kingdom of Judea, which is named for the tribe of Nabi Dawood, Judea, Yehuda, the only ones that are still there that aren't lost over time are the Yehudas and the Levites, right? So already you're starting to see the 12 tribes who previously had their own identifications by their tribe. It's all starting to get mishmashed together. Now the kingdom is actually called Yehuda, Judea as well. In 586, when the Babylonians come and they take over Jerusalem and they destroy the Haram Sharif and they burn the Torah and do all these horrible things under Nebuchadnezzar, all the ones that they don't massacre are sent, the Israelites are sent to Babylon. So when they're in Babylon, they become derisively referred to as, the Judeans, the Yehudis, right? And there is some evidence that Nabi Dawood alayhi salam would self-identify as a Yehudim because he's from that tribe. But this is actually now 400 years later in 586. So now you've got this, what was previously a tribal identification is now starting to be, or a national identification is starting to come to identify these people, at least to the outside world, right? So over time, what ends up happening is you have Cyrus the Great reconquer Al-Quds via his takeover of Babylon, and the Israelites are resettled. And so near the end of what's called, and he rebuilds the Haram Sharif. So that's what they call the Second Temple era. So that's 2nd or 1st century. You have these Israelites, and after Malachi, they haven't accepted any prophets. So they kind of are not accepting any of the later Christian prophets, like Nabi Zechariah alayhi salam from Beit al-Imran, right? Nabi Zechariah, Nabi Yahya, Nabi Isa alayhi salam. This is near the end of the Second Temple era. So you're starting to see fractionalizations. So you have a group, a sect from within the Israelites called the Pharisees. And then you have the Nazarenes, the Nasara, who are linked with Nazareth, which is the English for the Nasara. And they're closely associated as those, or defined as those Israelites that actually accepted the preaching of Nabi Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, and they accepted the other prophets, and they accepted the Injil, and so they become the predecessors to the Christians, the modern Christians. The Pharisees, actually what happens is they become the dominant strand, although you still have the Kohanim, who are the priestly class near the temple, but what ends up happening is in 70 AD, you have a destruction once again by Titus and the Romans of the Haram Sharif, and this time it's almost permanent. From a Muslim perspective, we believe Masjid al-Aqsa was rebuilt in 638 and onwards, and the Dome of the Rock was put on Masjid al-Aqsa in 691, 692. But if you're looking at it from a Jewish perspective, it was never to return to being the Solomonic temple. It was destroyed for all time. So that's in 70 AD. Over time, a lot of the Israelites who have not accepted Nabi Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, so from an Islamic perspective, they are now Ahl al-Kitab. They were no longer the Muslims of the day. The Nasara, the Nazarenes, are the Muslims, the believers of the day, because they've accepted the latest prophets and the latest revelation, the Nazarenes. So those are the Muslims of the day. So in 70 AD and onwards, if you're a Pharisee or you're a Jew at that point, you are starting to look at the situation and you're saying, look, we're never going to get the temple back. And for the longest time, Israelite religion and tradition and practice and liturgy day to day was centered on the Haram Sharif. So if that is destroyed, then you've got to find ways to carry on with your liturgy and in some ways decentralize the faith. This is what most scholars predominantly say for my studies. I don't think every last person will agree to this. Some people take it to the other extreme and they say, look, what happened next was a response to the Nazarenes becoming so prominent, and so the Pharisees had to create what came next in the form of Talmudic Judaism. Not everyone is willing to go that far, but generally what I've seen is the Pharisees start to reform the religion, and that leads to the rise of the rabbi, because the Kohanim were the descendants of Nabi Harun. I don't know if I mentioned that. So they're within the Levites. They're actually specific to Nabi Harun alayhi salam. And this actually leads to that cool ayah in Surah Maryam where they go, Ya Ukhta Harun. They're calling her Ukhta Harun because Sayyidah Maryam alayhi salam and Ali Imran are Kohanim. Generally speaking, the ulama believe Kahin in Arabic, because they're from that priestly class that are always linked to the Haram. They're always teaching. They're always imams in the Haram. So Sayyidah Maryam is from that exalted class. Her bloodline, she does have some of Nabi Dawood's blood, but her family, namely Sayyidina Imran, are Kohanim. So they're Levites. So this, again, is very rich tradition and is very complicated. But those Kohanim, when the Haram is destroyed, they lose their entire status in so many ways. So when you get to 70, 80, 90 AD, in Israelite or Jewish society, you're looking around and you're like, why are we still listening to these Kohanim? They used to exist in the temple that no longer exists. So that creates a decentralization of the faith, of the theology, of the liturgy, and you have this rise of the rabbinical class. And with it, the ahbar, the scribes. So that's why the ayah I love to talk about, إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَا التَّوْرَاةَ فِيهَا هُدًى وَنُورٌ يَحْكُمُ بِهَا النَّبِيُّونَ الَّذِينَ أَسْلَمُوا وَالَّذِينَ هَادُوا وَالرَّبَّانِيُّونَ وَالْأَحْبَارُ. It says, we did indeed reveal the Torah. In it was divine guidance and divine light. Same descriptors God uses to reference the Quran. يَحْكُمُ بِهَا النَّبِيُّونَ. Governed by it did the holy prophets. الَّذِينَ أَسْلَمُوا, who were submitters. They were Muslims. So we were supposed to read into that choice of terminology that God wants us to consider them part of our line of succession. وَالَّذِينَ هَادُوا وَالرَّبَّانِيُّونَ. And then those who later came to be Yehudis, and then those who later came to be rabbis and scribes. So it's actually tracking this entire dispensation of how you get from the first temple, second temple, to the post-temple Talmudic period. And the Quran actually jives with that. I always love that ayah. I just kind of discovered it maybe a year ago, being like, holy, that actually tracks the historic record. So this is a very long-winded history lesson for a lot of people, especially the Muslims, to understand the history of Yehuda. And so if you go, and Yehudaism. So if you go to Nabi Isa in 3080 or 2580 and you ask him, are you Jewish? He might say, are you referring to the country that I'm from? Because yeah, I'm from Judea. But if you're asking him if he is a Jew by religion, well, he's actually a Nazarene. And the people that came to form Talmudic Judaism and the religion that is now linked with that entire tradition, those are actually the Pharisees that actually rejected him. So it's actually a pretty complicated answer. So the simple answer is, yeah, he was Judaic in the sense that he came from that land that came to be linked to the predominant tribe that was Judea. But to say that he was Jewish in the modern Talmudic sense doesn't really make sense. And I've seen a lot of discussions on this and then a lot of even rabbinical lectures on it just not being clear-cut whether as a religious self-identifier, Israelites in the late Second Temple era would religiously call themselves Jews. Definitely if you're from that tribe or if you're from the kingdom of Judea, yeah, of course, you're Judaic, you're from that area. But as a religious identifier, and even in terms of if you're going to link that term to the modern practice of Judaism under the Talmud, that is entirely a post-Second Temple phenomenon and occurrence, which actually postdates Nabi Isa. So there's no simple answer, but it really comes down to who you ask. But I do think for the average Christian, this idea that Jesus was a Jew would be a relatively new phenomenon.
And I think even from, and if I may, from a Quranic perspective, right? A lot of people usually want to go with it that Jesus was a Jew, but Jesus, when he was calling to them, he didn't identify them as Yehudis, right? He identified them as Bani Israel. So
yeah,
right. So he did, like, if he was going to identify them with something, he would have used that.
Exactly. So from a Quranic perspective, you're bang on. The Quran never refers to any Israelite before Nabi Isa as a Yehudi. It actually tracks this historic understanding and trajectory, as I'll say. It always calls them Bani Israel, or when those prophets, as we've talked about in other episodes, are referencing their own people, they're saying, Ya qawmi, O my people. But Nabi Isa says, Ya Bani Israel. So the Quran, I know a lot of Muslims say they want to blame Jews for what the Israelites did, Bani Israel did, and how much they tormented Nabi Musa alayhi salam. That's actually not fair and is theologically incorrect from an Islamic perspective and a scriptural standpoint. We actually don't believe that those people were Jews, and so you can't blame what they did on the Jews. They were just Israelites from whom you had the Pharisees that then came to form modern Judaism, but you also had from them come the Nasara, the Nazarenes, who formed modern Christianity. And this actually leads into another question that we always talk about whether Muslims are Ishmaelites, right? And in the biblical tradition, we are considered Ishmaelites and Saracens and all these things. But if you're wondering from an Islamic standpoint, if the average outsider, Muslims probably understand this well. But if a non-Muslim is wondering whether we consider ourselves Ishmaelites, we do not. So if you're, for example, a Qurayshi...
I've never even actually heard that term used until, reading from other authors.
For sure.
This is an unknown term to mainstream Muslims, I would say.
Exactly. And because Islam doesn't give credence from a theological standpoint to genealogy, whereas obviously Judaism in a classical sense does. So if you're going to say Muslims are Ishmaelites, they're actually applying a bit of a Judaic lens to Islamic theology and tradition. The one corollary to that is if you're a Qurayshi, for example, 3 of my grandparents would have, according to our family tree, would be Qurayshis by their ancestry, right? In fact, all 4 of them, right, would be Qurayshi. So if you're a Qurayshi, you're descended from Fihr ibn Malik, and he is descended from Ismail alayhi salam. So Qurayshis are actually Ishmaelites. So the Prophet sallallahu the Siddiqis, the Faruqis, the Umayyads, the Amawids, the Abbasis, all these people are actually Ishmaelites. But Islam, remember, is a proselytizing religion where we don't really care about your genealogies. You can be a member of the former penal colony in Australia and accept Islam and you're a Muslim. It doesn't matter that no longer linked, or you're not linked to Ishmael whatsoever, right? But it also, namely, calling Muslims Ishmaelites entirely confuses and does a disservice to our actual theology. Because when you say we're Ishmaelites, it ignores the fact that the vast majority of the prophets that we revere and love and who we follow are actually from the Isaacite, the Israelite tradition. So if you're asking me, am I Ishmaelite? I'll say I'm an Ishmaelite and an Isaacite, both. Whereas Jews and Christians would see themselves as only Isaacites. And I've heard a lot of even very conciliatory rabbis that are big on interfaith say, no, these are Ishmaelites and they're our cousins in faith, and I appreciate the gesture. But theologically, from our scriptural standpoint, we're actually both Ishmaelite and Isaacite because we accept prophets from both.
I would actually go one step further, Mujir.
Okay.
I'm not technically disagreeing with you, but I'm technically disagreeing with you, and just say we're all Abrahamites.
Yeah.
Like, why would we even go to the kids? You know what I mean? Go to, the Prophet Ibrahim. Go straight to the source, because I think that's how. And this is a take, but this is how people end up dividing people and putting people into groups and saying these guys are good and these guys are bad and blah 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 blah. No, man. We all have the exact same roots. Our roots come from Prophet Abraham or Ibrahim. You could even take it all the way up to Adam if you want to be that guy. But the reality is, it is all this.
No, I understand that. But at the end of the day, a lot of times when people call us Ishmaelite, it is either to perpetuate a narrative that we don't belong to the Isaacite tradition or we don't agree with it. And that's why so many people, Jewish, Christian, are so surprised when we tell them that Israelites are our predecessors in faith too, and we consider them to be part of the Muslim tradition. They're like, what are you talking about? Yeah. And it's because I think part of this language and discourse has been advanced about Muslims being Ishmaelites, and that actually
it's a major
exactly. It doesn't actually explain, and in fact creates that misunderstanding of what Islamic tradition actually is.
Yeah, and I think that was done even without our permissions, if I may. Like, I think that
goes to an external projection.
Absolutely, yeah. It's an external projection. That's why Abrahamites is the new term we're going to start projecting out here, because if my brother is an Isaacite and I'm an Ishmaelite, then we're just brothers. You know what I mean? Like, now we're a crew. But if you just put me in isolation, then everyone's always...
But the challenge with saying we're Abrahamites, obviously we are, it doesn't then establish that you're still also within the Isaac.
But does anyone refer to the Isaac as Isaacites? Is that a...
No, but they're from the Isaacian line, right?
Yeah. So, but it doesn't diminish anything, is what I'm trying to say. Right?
No, but what I'm saying is, like, not only are we Abrahamic with you guys, we're also...
Oh, of course.
Believe in the Isaac.
We take all those guys.
That's my point.
No, I agree with that. Yeah. But they just want us to be in our own little island.
And listen, we are different. We have the Quran. We've got our own... Yeah, I agree. We are different, but generally we're sewn from the same cloth.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's how we see it. You don't have to see it that way if you're not a Muslim. All the power to you, but that's not going to change our aqidah and our belief.
Yeah. We believe we're part of the same crew, guys, just a little bit different in the end. But this is one Abrahamic faith going forward. I think that's
so. I mean, I know that was a very long-winded answer.
Yeah.
Like
that was one question, Mujir.
Anything else? Do we have time for anything else?
That was one question. No, I think. Well, do we? I don't know, but I think that's good. I think we can end it with that. I think that was really good. That was, I expected that question to be. I never...
Yes or no.
Yeah, yes or no.
There's always, like we say, somewhere in between.
Yeah, and I think that was a great thing for a lot of people. I don't think many Muslims know the heritage of Bani Israel. They're unaware of it.
Can't wait to see the comments of people being like, "You're wrong. You're a liar," because they espouse one account that has 15 counter accounts. I don't really care to get into people's partisan ideas. God bless you. Have your own theories and takes on it, but we're not talking about Winston Churchill or Bill Clinton here. The historic record on these people and these facts is far from settled, right? So remember what history is. It's simply stacking the primary accounts and the resources that you have and trying to come up with a probabilistic interpretation of what actually happened. That's my take.
All right. And that's all the time we got for you guys. I hope you had a wonderful time watching. I'm sure the comment sections, as Mujir said, will be on fire. Can't wait to see it. And we will see you again next time on the Sands of Time podcast. There you go.
How was that for forcefulness?
That was great, bro.
Yeah, alhamdulillah.